My name is Barbara Phillips, Executive Director of Community Network Council in Kent, Washington, where we've been dealing with academics excellence for the past 10 years or so. And we have some of our colleagues on attending: Aubrey Shinholster, our IT specialist and vice president; Melvin Tate, our educational advisor; and Dr. Eddie Moore, another advisor. So good evening, everyone. We have an exciting meeting today, presentation from Ricky Robertson. And I'm going to pass it on over to Dr. Moore to introduce Ricky and let the show begin. Thanks.
Okay. You hear me okay, Aubrey? Everything good? You hear me? Okay, great. Yes, just saying hello to everybody. Welcome everyone for another opportunity to engage one of the people we believe we've come to get to know that is really leading the nation, if not the world, around the topic of self-care, behavior communication, young people, our cultural responsive counseling. I mean, all the kind of things that are circulating in the school building that sometimes we're not so sure what it all means. We've been fortunate at CNC to have someone to just be able to come in and give us and work with us around some really important issues to make sense of it all. And so Ricky is back again today to talk about what I think is a very interesting topic, which is behavior as a form of communications, which I can't wait to get to learning about and hearing more, pun intended. So without any ado, I want to pass it to Ricky Robertson. He could talk a little bit about some of his credentials. We call him friend, we call him family. I mean, he's been rolling with CNC now and really, as I said, I think helping us light some lights along the path as we continue to work with young people, as Barbara mentioned, for a decade plus now. I'm fortunate to be part of the team most recently and to have worked with Aubrey and Brother Melvin, Brother Tate, Sister Barbara Phillips. And so I'm just honored to be a part of the team. And so today, as part of CNC, we welcome y'all. And Ricky, I'm going to pass it to you, family, to get the learning started.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Tate, Mr. Shinholster. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and if I could have permission to share my screen, I would appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll begin our conversation this evening around behavior as a form of communication. Thank you, Aubrey, for that. And with that being said, I'm joining you all this evening from my home in San Francisco, the unceded lands of the Ohlone peoples. I also happen to live on one of the tallest hills in San Francisco, so you'll occasionally see a bunch of, it gets to be a pretty busy area actually behind me, so you'll occasionally maybe hear some of the bells from the streetcar trolleys as they make their way past my window, and see some of the folks driving up the hill and lights flashing and whatnot. So I also apologize for any distractions with that, particularly the auditory distractions, because sometimes they go really wild with the with the bells. They want everybody to know at night that the street trolleys are making their way up California Street. So with that being said, it's an honor to be here this evening, and we're going to be looking at behavior as a form of communication. And for those of you who are attending this evening for the first time and you haven't attended any of the previous sessions that I've been able to be a guest on with CNC. My name is Ricky Robertson, and I'm a consultant and coach for different schools and school districts around the US and Canada on developing social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students, especially students impacted by adverse childhood experiences or ACEs and trauma. And I'm the co-author of a book called Building Resilience in Students Impacted by Adverse Childhood Experiences, along with Victoria Romero, who is a retired principal of 2 turnaround schools in the Seattle area. And prior to that was a classroom teacher for 35 years. And Amber Warner, who is a licensed clinical social worker who works in schools, private practice, and hospitals with children and families impacted by trauma. I also have the good fortune to collaborate with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris in the California Surgeon General's office. And the model that my co-authors and I developed and presented in our book was actually adopted and included in the California Roadmap for Resilience as an example of best practices in trauma-informed care for public schools. So with that being said, we had a session this past Saturday where we talked about adverse childhood experiences and trauma and its impact on young people's brain development, emotional development, cognition. I'm going to touch on some of those topics this evening, just as a quick recap, but also for some of you, it might be new information, but it's critical information to give a context for why and how we view behavior as a form of communication. So before we dive into that conversation, there's something that I do at the start of every single one of my sessions. It's kind of an opening routine or ritual for me, which is to just take a moment and to think about one thing that you feel grateful for within the last 24 hours. So just take that moment to take a deep breath, think about your day, think about yesterday, think about anything that you feel thankful for, and please feel free to enter that in the chat if you feel comfortable. I think for me, I'm especially feeling thankful for health and well-being, especially as I read the news about these different variants and whatnot. And I'm also deeply grateful for my family. And I'm going to get to go home to Florida on Saturday and see my family during the holidays. And so I'm certainly thankful for that blessing as well. So think about what you're feeling thankful for. Please feel free to enter that into the chat. And folks are expressing gratitude for old and new friends, family, for health, well-being, for parents, children, jobs, coworkers. And I invite folks to reflect on what they're grateful for, because it gives us just kind of a moment of bite-sized resilience, if you will, right before potentially we have some conversations that might be a little challenging. So it helps to kind of, I think, give us that emotional fortification to have conversations that might be a little bit more difficult. And this evening, when we talk about behavior as a form of communication, I'm actually going to begin with a story. And it's a true story, and I'm going to change the names of the individuals involved. But I want to kind of give a content warning and say that I'm about to share a story that's going to talk about some tough topics related to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and trauma. And so I'm going to be discussing a story that may involve aspects of addiction, abuse, neglect, etc. So I want to let folks know ahead of time, because if that is particularly stirring or triggering or difficult for you, I want to encourage you to please care for your well-being in the course of our conversation today. And so if you need to step back, stretch, get a drink of water, whatever you need to support your well-being, please do so. So the story that I'm going to tell is from when I was working for a school district as a behavior specialist, and I had multiple schools on my caseload. And there was one elementary school that was on my caseload, and I was at the elementary school that day, and I'm going to tell a story about two different students in that school. So the first student was a 5th grade young woman. I'm going to call her Melissa. And Melissa had very severe behaviors. She would yell, scream, curse, throw things, sometimes physically aggress against other students, physically aggress against her teacher. Her teacher could not tell her no, could not redirect her without her having this huge behavioral escalation. In fact, sometimes Melissa would get so upset, so angry, so dysregulated, she would go out into the hallway and she would intentionally urinate in the middle of the 5th grade hallway. That entire wing of the building knew when this child was having a bad day. It was impossible to teach. So that's Melissa. Melissa's in 5th grade. The other child that I want to talk about was, I'm going to call her Sarah, and Sarah was in 4th grade. And Sarah was a delight to have in class. She was helpful, thoughtful, kind, hardworking. She was strong academically. She even liked to show up early at school and water the plants in her teacher's classroom. And one day, Sarah's teacher calls down to the office and says, Sarah asked to use the restroom. She's been gone for quite a while. Would someone go look for her? So two of the women working in the front office, they go to check the women's restrooms, the girls' bathrooms around the school. And I'm walking around the outside of the school and I find this little girl crouched behind a portable and she's just ripping her hair out and she's hitting herself in the head saying, stupid, stupid. And what we learned was that every time Sarah would get back a test or a quiz, she would ask to use the bathroom, but she would actually go hide somewhere and self-harm in some way. So, true story, Sarah and Melissa are sisters. And when Melissa was in kindergarten, so several years earlier, her behavior was even more severe, if you can believe it. And the kindergarten teacher had contacted the counselor contacted the parents. There ended up being a Child Protective Services investigation. And it was learned that Sarah and Melissa were raised by two parents who were heavily addicted to opiates and would often lock the two girls in a bedroom for several hours to several days at a time. They would leave leftover boxes of pizza or food in the room, and the two girls would urinate and defecate in the corner of the room. I tell this story because here we see two young women who experienced similar trauma, very severe, abuse and neglect, during a similar stage of brain development from birth to ages 4 and 5, when about 80% of the brain is developing. But they have responded to that trauma in wildly different ways. And so on the one hand, we have students like Melissa, and they don't have to be as their behaviors don't have to be as severe as Melissa, but students that are more externalizing. In other words, they communicate their emotion, their frustration, etc., through aggression, tantrums, meltdowns, and being non-compliant, defiant, disrespectful. And sometimes on some level, these young people feel like in order to feel safe, I need to be in charge. And if you think about Melissa's upbringing, that makes a lot of sense. Because if she had been quiet and permissive, etc., she probably would have died from neglect in that room. She had to raise hell, so to speak, in order to get the attention she felt she needed in order to get her caregivers to pay attention, even to probably let them out of that bedroom that they were locked in. So when you have children that have these more externalizing behaviors where they feel like they need to be in control in order to feel safe, that can be very difficult, very challenging. And it also presents a problem for the parent, caregiver, or teacher, or the adult who's working with that young person, because that young person is in a double bind. If Melissa got the level of control she thinks she needs in order to feel safe, then she would be an 11-year-old girl who was in charge and more powerful than all of the other adults at home and in the school building, which for a child means when I need help and I'm the one who's running the show all the time, because the adults around me let me get my way all the time, then I'm more powerful than everybody here. So if I need help, who can I rely on? Nobody. So it actually increases that sense of fear and anxiety. And so we have to realize that responding to behavior in a trauma-informed way does not mean being permissive. It means how do we respond to the behavioral needs of young people in ways that are both connected and firm. Jay Nelson talks about thinking like you're a tree. You have deep roots and you have some sway and flexibility. You can hold a young person in positive regard and also hold them accountable and help them learn how to get their needs met in healthier ways. And when we talk about consequences, we're not just talking about arbitrary punishment. We're talking about consequences that are either solutions to the problem or they're natural consequences. They make sense given the harm that was done. Now, I primarily work in schools, so let me give an example of that. If a child is cheating on an exam and I just punish them by taking away recess, that's an arbitrary punishment. It doesn't do anything to help that young person learn. Now, a consequence that might be a solution is maybe that young person does need to stay in, unfortunately, during recess, but we're going to work together and we're going to go over the material that they're struggling with, and we're going to figure out how to help them understand what they're learning so they're not going to be lost and confused. So that's a consequence, but it's also a solution because it's going to help that person learn that content so that they don't have to cheat again in the future. Or if I have a student who has written their name over a bunch of desks in my classroom, then I might have a restorative conversation with that student, and that student might agree to clean their name off of the desks in that classroom, because that's a natural consequence. That makes sense. Right. Now, then we have children like Sarah that are more internalizers: anxiety, depression, withdrawal, low self-esteem, greater likelihood for self-harming behaviors, perfectionism, people-pleasing, intimate partner violence, substance abuse issues, eating disorders. And these young people can actually sadly very easily fall through the cracks, because sometimes we think that trauma means behavioral problems, and we don't realize that many people learn to survive trauma by becoming caretakers, people pleasers, becoming incredibly perfectionistic. So these young people need a lot more support with building trusting relationships, with actually having adults who step into the role of being an adult and don't parentify the child, but and that are also able to listen and to help that young person self-regulate, help that young person to have a positive sense of self, have a young person who feels comfortable with things being good enough and not needing them to be perfect in order to feel safe. So some of the ways that we start to address this is when we realize, and this is something we talked about Saturday, that our young people are exposed often to, and we can look at research that shows that about 50% of young people sitting in a typical classroom in a typical American high school, doesn't matter, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender, geographic region, the majority of high school students sitting in American high school classrooms have experienced at least one, two, or multiple adverse childhood experiences. These can be things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, death of a parent, incarceration of a parent, someone in the home suffering from a mental illness or substance abuse issue. These can be forms of community trauma, such as community violence, poverty, lack of jobs that pay a living wage, lack of affordable housing. We spoke on Saturday also about forms of historical, generational, and cumulative trauma related to forms of systemic oppression, be it racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, anti-immigrant discrimination, etc. And then there are also forms of trauma that can occur within the environment, natural disasters such as wildfires, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. And then we have the pandemic, which in the past year and a half, we have seen skyrocketing rates of domestic violence, parent and caregiver substance abuse, anxiety, depression, relapse, and suicidality. And we have young people that have been in greater degrees of isolation. So we are working in a time where, in some respects, the prevalence of trauma has actually increased. Access to care and support has actually decreased quite a bit for young people. And we're seeing them express through their behavior the impacts of this time. And perhaps you've noticed some of the young people that you work with experiencing more anxiety, depression, withdrawal, aggression. Some young people might become more clingy, others might become more avoidant and withdrawn, because we understand there's a whole spectrum along which we can manifest the symptoms of exposure to ACEs and trauma. Something we also spoke about Saturday that we need to reference again is that we know that trauma impacts the way that the brain develops and functions, especially when a young person does not have enough access to protective factors. When a young person experiences trauma and does not have protective factors like safe enough relationships at home, at school, or in the community, doesn't have a safe enough home, reliable sources of food, water, adequate medical care, etc., doesn't have the protective factors of things that they enjoy or are passionate about or give them a sense of hope or possibility. When a young person experiences significant trauma and does not have those protective factors or enough of them in place, they have a toxic stress response in the body. It triggers that survival center of the brain in our brainstem region, that fight, flight, and freeze center of the brain. And that part of the brain remains hyper escalated, hyper aroused, and disrupts functioning in the prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes, making it very difficult for that young person to focus their attention, manage their emotions, communicate their thoughts, feelings, and needs, and take on or hear other people's perspectives, manage their behavior in healthy ways, even think about consequences before they take actions. It disrupts the ability to regulate emotions, to self-regulate states of arousal, and also disrupts the capacity for executive functioning. And so when we think about understanding behavior through this trauma-informed lens, we start to understand, wow, a lot of the behaviors I might be seeing might be communicating to me some of this young person's unmet needs for safety, for belonging, for feeling valued, those protective factors that help to cultivate the innate capacity that each and every human being has for resilience. And the good news is what you're seeing here is a brain scan, by the way, of two different children. One who, they're both the same age, but one who had not experienced any trauma and one who was in an orphanage at the time of the study and had experienced significant abuse and neglect. And one of the things I want to point out is there was a follow-up study done 3 months after this, and it found that as soon as a young person was placed in a loving, caring, adoptive home, within 3 months, their pattern of brain development started to improve. Their pattern of brain functioning started to improve. The brain has this innate capacity for resilience, this neuroplasticity that is with us throughout our entire lives. So if you form a relationship with a young person as a mentor, a teacher, a social worker, a therapist, or even a parent or a caregiver, where that young person feels like there are healthy boundaries, where they are respected, where they are heard, where they are accepted, where they are valued, where they are getting to learn ways to handle conflict, handle emotions, ask for what they need in healthy, respectful, appropriate ways, we are actually helping that young person's brain to rewire itself that are going to benefit them years after their time with us. And that can begin at any stage in a human being's life because our brain has that capacity for neuroplasticity even into adulthood. That's why when people go into things like 12-step recovery or they become sober, it doesn't matter what age they are, their brain starts to turn towards health, well-being, and resilience, even if it's just gradual at first or a small change. So when we view behavior, and so I want to emphasize that because it's hope, it's understanding that our past is not our destiny. Right. And so when we view behavior as a form of communication, we understand that young people are communicating needs for safety, belonging, and feeling valued. And I mentioned this Saturday, I want to mention it again. We're not talking about good behavior or bad behavior. We're just talking about behavior. So you have one child who wants to feel a sense of safety, belonging, and feeling valued, so they join a sports team. You have another child who wants to feel a sense of safety, belonging, and feeling valued. They join a gang. Our work is, how do I help this young person to get those needs met in ways that are healthy, ways that are going to not harm them or others, ways that are going to help them to be successful in school and in life. So when we look at safety, we look at physical safety, consistency, routines, intellectual safety, how we help a young person talk through challenges and mistakes, and how we help them to learn from those experiences. What is a challenge you faced and how did you grow from it? We create social emotional safety, which is not to shame a child, not to say, well, I got mine, so now you get yours. In other words, I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, now it's your turn. But we lean into a willingness to be vulnerable, a willingness to look for the good in that young person and reflect it back to them through positive acknowledgement, through even teaching them how to accept responsibility for mistakes. When I make a mistake or I cause harm, I try to apologize. I try to think about how what I did impacted the other person. And then I take action to repair the situation. Sometimes we have to actually talk through and teach young people, this is how to accept responsibility for a situation where maybe you made a mistake or caused harm or didn't keep your word. Because behavior is a form of communication, meaning it's like a language. We start communicating through our behavior before we even learn to speak. Babies cry, fuss, laugh, yell, hug. I mean, before they can even speak, you have a toddler who will grab your, or a baby rather, who will grab your finger, who will smile at you, who will cry when they're upset. They are communicating through their behavior before they even learn their first word. So it is like a language. We look at how our parents and caregivers react, how our siblings react, how the adults in our lives respond to situations, and that becomes our behavioral language. If you have a child whose father, every time he's angry, yells, screams, curses, and punches his fist through the wall, then that child is learning a behavioral language of fist through the wall. Meaning when that child gets to school and they're upset, confused, angry, etc., they're going to yell, scream, curse, and maybe even throw their book across the classroom because they have learned a behavioral language of fist through the wall. They have learned that when I am feeling these difficult emotions, this is how you're supposed to behave. And they didn't learn that because we told them to do those things. They learned it by watching us, because they learn more by what we do than what we say. And so just like having to learn a new language, and I'm almost 40, I'm still trying to learn Spanish. My mom is fluent in Spanish. She grew up in Puerto Rico. I can speak 5 words of it. How long does it take to learn a new language? Typically 3 to 7 years. So if a child has some severe challenging behaviors, they're going to need several months, even years of consistent support. Behavior communicates a fundamental need for belonging. Positive, healthy relationships are an essential component, an essential protective factor. We talked about the impact of cell phones and screen time on parenting, and the fact that so many young people have learned to settle for attention and negative attention as a substitute for authentic connection and belonging. Because a lot of kids, they have to act up and misbehave in order to get their parent or caregiver to put their phone down and directly interact with them, which teaches a child, if I have to misbehave to get you to pay attention to me, that's what I'm going to do. Which means when I get in trouble, it's not even going to bother me, because that's going to be the moment when I feel like I matter. So setting aside that time, that critical, let's put some screen time limits on the phone. Let's set this phone aside. Let me actually talk with this young person, see how their day is going, see what's important to them, what's going on in their world. And if I'm working with a teenager, that might be a very brief conversation because they might not want to share a lot with me, especially at first, until that trust is built. But let me start to build that relationship and have that quality time where I am present for that conversation. I am not on my phone in that moment as the adult. And lastly, behavior communicates a need for feeling valued, for voice and choice, for appropriate choices, like a democracy. Like, I hear what you're saying, and these are the choices. Feeling valued, very much connected to motivation. So I'm going to begin to kind of wrap up this portion of the evening to turn it over to questions that have come up, but there's a few things that I want to touch on before I do that. One is the importance of consistency and being connected and firm. That when we're forming relationships, whether it's a mentoring relationship, a therapeutic relationship, a relationship as a teacher, or even as a parent or caregiver, we have to look at, am I consistent, connected, and firm? Because if I'm all over the place and I'm stretched thin and I'm dysregulated and I am inconsistent with that young person, one day that child does something and I'm laughing, and the next day they're getting punished for the exact same thing just because my mood has changed, that inconsistency is going to negatively impact my child. Or if I am an educator, if I'm a therapist, if I'm a mentor, am I consistent, reliable, dependable? Does that young person understand the boundaries of our relationship, how they can get in touch with me, what types of support I can provide, when I'm going to check in with them? And am I connected and firm? Do I connect before I correct behavior? I can tell you're frustrated, but what you just said was really hurtful. Or I can tell you're angry, but we don't throw things in here. Please pick that up. Right? So connecting before we correct behavior, being both consistent as well as connected and firm. Leaning into positive relationships is so critical. I hope that you understand that if you work as a mentor with young people, a therapist, educator, etc., that forming those healthy, supportive relationships are such a critical protective factor. Harvard University did research to try to figure out how come you can have children from the same community, even the same family, experience trauma, and one of them can go on to not just survive, but thrive. And another child, even a sibling, can end up stuck in cycles of just getting by, survival, can't hold down a job, etc. And obviously, there's a lot of factors at play, but one of the most critical components for fostering resilience and well-being is when young people have a relationship with a healthy, protective, supportive adult, when they need it. So that can be at any point between birth and age 18, or even beyond that, but we're specifically talking about young people right now. And young people that have those healthy, supportive relationships when they need it are far more likely to be resilient. It helps physiologically to allow the toxic stress response caused by trauma to calm down. The body can down-regulate, and that toxic stress response becomes tolerable stress because that young person feels a sense of safety and support. And those relationships can be with a parent, a family member, and I'm going to specifically talk about adults here because obviously you can have friendships with peers and siblings, but with teachers, therapists, mentors, volunteers within the community, and also family members as well. So in other words, each and every person on this session this evening has the potential to make a profound difference in the life of a young person. But sometimes it's like watering a seed, and we might not see the fruits of our efforts and our labor blossom. In other words, you might invest in working with a young person, and you might not see the shift in their being, in their behavior, and the way they relate to the world and themselves, because it might not happen until years down the road. A couple months ago, I got a phone call from a colleague of mine back in New York City when I was a high school teacher there, and she said, there's a student who contacted the school. You taught him about 13 years ago, and he wants your phone number. Is it okay if we give him your number? And I said, sure. And so I get a call from this, at this point, he's a grown man, right? So I get a call from this young man, and he goes on to tell me about how after he graduated high school, and I remember him, a lot of things were happening. He ended up getting arrested. He ended up in prison for a number of years. He had some addiction issues even as a teenager. I remembered it. And he goes on to tell me all of the different things that I had said to him back when I was his high school math teacher. And I used to talk to him about his life and what he was going through. He even said things that were quotes of things my grandmother had said to me that apparently I had said to him, right? Because I had passed on the love my grandmother gave me to the young people that I worked with. My grandmother was critical in raising me when I was growing up. And so he remembered that. And he said, when I was in prison, I used to remember those things. And I want you to know that I'm sober now. I'm a manager of a restaurant. And my mom said, you got to call your math teacher from high school and tell him what happened to you, because you still talk about the things he said to you. So sometimes we never know our impact. The last thing I want to end on is routines, consistent, connected, firm, relationships, and then lastly, regulation. A lot of young people these days are struggling with anxiety and depression. In fact, the Pew Center did a study, and it was the #1 challenge that American high school students said that they face in school is anxiety and depression. That is fundamentally a challenge with self-regulation. So how do we help young people to self-regulate? Well, first of all, and I'm not going to go too deep into the science behind this, but we have mirror neurons in our brain. And so one of the first ways that we regulate as human beings, and by regulate, I mean we find an ability to recover from the stress of the day. We find a place or a space within ourselves where we can be calm, assertive, and present. And in order to self-regulate, in order to find that calm, one of the things that helps us is to co-regulate, which means that we have these mirror neurons. And so we're more likely to be calm and present and assertive when the people around us are. That's especially true for young people, and especially for little children, like pre-K, elementary, and then even on into adults. This is true. It's easier for us to feel calm and present when we feel connected with other folks that are calm and present. So one of the first things we can do to help the young people we work with is to practice self-care. to put our own oxygen mask on first. And self-care is not self-improvement. It is an orientation of kindness towards the self. So what are those simple things you can do, whether it's prayer, meditation, going for a walk, getting a cup of coffee or tea, whatever you need to do throughout the day to alleviate stress in healthy ways so that you can be present with that child. Even if you're a parent or a caregiver, that might even mean, let me take a minute before I respond to this behavior, because I know I'm at the end of my rope. And a dysregulated adult cannot help a dysregulated child. It's like pouring fuel on the fire. So maybe I need to take a step back. Maybe I need to take some deep breaths. Maybe I need to remind myself this is only a child. This too shall pass. Let me be the adult here and respond in a way that is connected and firm. Because by first self-regulating, we help that young person to co-regulate. Then we can, with older students, actually help them to develop some self-regulation skills. So things like mindfulness, taking deep breaths. There's mindfulness videos. There's a hip hop artist named Just Me. It's all one word. He has different mindfulness videos that are great for middle school students, even high school, just to learn about mindfulness strategies. There's apps like the Calm app and things like that. Headspace. There are even some free versions for young people. Mindfulness, movement. Do the young people we work with, are they getting enough exercise, enough movement, whatever that might look like for them? Could look like sports, could look like running, could look like yoga, could look like dance, but are they just going from sitting in a classroom to sitting in front of a video game all night? Because that's very dysregulating to the body. So sometimes just going for a walk with me, talk with me. In other words, you've been sitting in school all day, let's go for a walk and talk. And that sometimes helps a young person to down-regulate if they're feeling anxious. The other thing is to help them make things manageable. Let's make a priority list. Tell me everything you need to get done for school, everything that's stressing you out. Let's write it all down on paper so we can see it. And then now let's put first things first. What do we need to get done first? What do we need to get done second? What do we need to get done third? And what can wait? And let's start with the thing you hate the most and get started on that, because once we get that out of the way, everything else is going to be easy. So when we think about or sitting down with a young person who's really struggling with focusing and attention and maybe attention deficit issues, could also be symptoms of complex PTSD, and saying, let's spend some time organizing your materials. Let's get you organized. Those are ways that we help to make things manageable and alleviate some of that stress and some of that anxiety. If you work with really young children, there's also a great resource from Sound Discipline, which is an organization based out of Seattle that I really love, which is that they have these sound discipline regulation tool cards. And these are great for pre-K and early elementary, like little ones, that you could use as a parent, caregiver, et cetera. And I'm seeing if I have them saved on my computer, that if I could just put them in the chat, the PDF of them. They're available for free. There's about 60 different regulation activities that you could do with little ones. Okay. I might not have it downloaded. Well, I have it downloaded. I just might not be able to add it in the chat. Anyhow, let me try one more thing. Okay. So I'll find a link for that to send along. But so routines, consistency, connected and firm, relationships, and regulation, helping people, young people manage stress in healthy ways. These are some of the foundational things we could do to address some of those needs for safety, belonging, and feeling valued. I'm going to go ahead and unshare this PowerPoint and transition into the other portion of our evening together, which is to open the floor to any questions, anything that folks are curious about. Could even be scenarios that you want to talk through and problem solve, anything that sparks your interest or curiosity as we talk about behavior as a form of communication. And Dr. Moore, I'm going to hand the floor over to you at this time.
Yeah, and I'm gonna thank you, Ricky. Ricky, if we can just give a little emoji, y'all, give a little something to let Ricky know. I'm trying to role model that there. Thank you, thank you. Hoping that each and every last one of us found something that was helpful. And now this is a chance to ask any questions, like Ricky said, maybe present a scenario or case study, and maybe get him to respond to. Ricky, I was just gonna ask you about a question I put in the chat, which is what you had me reflecting on is how I got parented, taught, coached is sometimes how I parent, teach, and coach. And back in the 80s, some of those things weren't so healthy, if you know what I mean. And so I think about, for example, spanking my kids, which was always an answer for me. I felt like something that I endured and something I'm revisiting as a parent now. Mainly thinking about the possible trauma, the impact. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you work with people to reconsider what they may have endured as something they may use, whether you're coaching, parenting, teaching, so on and so forth. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. One of them is the self-regulation piece for the adult is so critical because so many folks that I work with, especially if they're parents or caregivers, they're kind of at the end of their rope a lot of the time. They're exhausted, they're fried, they're pulled in so many different directions. And so even when they know how they would like to handle things, when they're actually in the moment of having, for example, a toddler having a meltdown, even though they know that they would like to not yell or scream or hit their child, when they are swept up, anxious, dysregulated as the adult, they inevitably go back to those neural pathways that have the most habit energy, that are the most ingrained in us. And that could be connected to the way we were raised. So we can't work against our biology and our neural pathways. We have to work with them. And so we have to understand, okay, based on how I was raised, based on what I'm used to, based on how I handle stress, when my child starts acting up, my impulse is to smack them. My impulse is to, or sometimes to ignore them and stonewall them. My impulse is to push them away. My impulse is to say something sarcastic or threatening because that's my impulse, or that's how I was raised, or that's just how I handle stress. I go into that fight mode. So we kind of have to know ourselves and be a little bit honest. And we have to say, you know something, I would do a better job as a parent if the next time my child starts acting up, I actually took a minute before I responded and I didn't dive right into it, because the world isn't going to end just because my toddler's having a meltdown at the store. Like, and it's only going to make it worse if I smack them or threaten them or get sarcastic or whatever our style is, because we all have a different kind of edge that can come out. It might actually be better for me to realize I'm going to handle this situation better if I first take a moment to take a deep breath and find my calm and remember that this is a child and I am the adult. This is a child and I am the adult. And I'm going to handle this in a more appropriate way. And so I might have to speak to that child very calmly. I might and also assertively. I might have to give that child some choices. I might have to weather the storm of this meltdown and not give in, because some of us are actually permissive. So when the tantrum starts, we're not going to smack the kid. We're going to give them what they want just because we don't want to have to put up with the hassle of the meltdown. So sometimes it's like, I'm going to stay connected to my child and say, I know that you're upset that we can't get that toy. I understand you really want that toy. And I would be angry too, but we can't get it. We can't afford it. And it's okay. You can be upset. You can cry about it. And we're still not getting that toy and we're going to go home. And so sometimes we have to have that both, like, I'm going to be connected, I'm going to acknowledge what you're feeling, and I have to be firm, because some of us go to be very permissive. Others, we go to the more strict disciplinarian route, and we're trying to find that space that's kind of in the middle and what that looks like for us. But that's not available to us until we first take that moment to kind of find our calm before we react. Because otherwise we're going to default to how we were raised or to what our habit energy is.
Habit energy. I gotta put that in the hashtag right there. That one's pretty good right there. I think we need a CNC boot camp. I don't know what, well, maybe let me just speak in I statements. I need a CNC boot camp, but let's talk about that later. I see Aaliyah, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, let me know. Aaliyah, I see your hand up. You have a question for Ricky?
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. It's been the best thing that I have stumbled across. I'm dealing with all this with my son, and he's 11 in the diversion program now. You know, with the school superintendent, the principal, his teacher, a counselor, behavioralist, like we're having all these IEP meetings. And I just wish that all of those people could get on board. Like, how do I get this information out to them so that we could all be consistent in the way that we approach him when he is dysregulated?
Oh,
And
yes.
to help him calm down. And the other thing is, during our diversion 2-hour interview, she brought up all these trauma and things that we had to talk about, never closed it up, never did the beginning thing like you did. We had to talk about his dad dying when he was 4.5, me being a recovering alcoholic, the abuse that I put on him, and there was no care around. We left that place just, you know, feeling
Yes.
so much more.
Yeah.
So how do I get them involved?
Yeah, nobody's sutured the wound, right? So you open all that up for a family, talking about all of that, and then you just leave them with the wound, and you don't suture the wound, right? So I feel like that's like a kind of, that's very common, and it makes me very upset because I think that trauma-informed care is becoming this like buzzword right now, and people are not realizing that you have to think about first of all, you have to think about the emotional impact. You also have to think about you have to think about how you center resilience in the conversation, not center the trauma. So I want to, so if we're going to talk about the trauma, I also want to hear, how did you get through that as a family? What were the things that held you together? I want to highlight the love that you all have for one another, that you were able to endure those things and pull through and be here today, advocating for your child, looking to do better, etc. I want to land on looking for, where is that resilience? Because it's there, but that, I don't just want to focus on this horrible thing, this painful thing, this loss. I want to focus on the strength that's there. Because what I'm seeing in front of me is a family with a lot of strength, with a lot of love, with an incredible commitment to one another. So to get to your question though, how do I get folks on the same page? So that's a problem with wraparound services in general. And it's one that's especially difficult because then how do you as the parent advocate to get folks on the same page? So I think one of the things that you want to think about is, when you're thinking about the supports that your son needs, I think you want to kind of come up with a list of priorities of what do you feel would be the most beneficial. So for example, if I were the parent of a young person that had very severe behavioral escalations at school, like in other words, fights, throwing things, physical assault, all the things, I would definitely want to make sure that that staff, everybody who works with my child, has what's sometimes referred to as a behavior script or an escalation map, where they know what every stage of my child's behavioral escalations look like and what to do and what not to do in those moments. And I would want them to observe my child in school, map that escalation process, map what works and what doesn't work, and disseminate that to everybody so that we start to get on the same page. I would want to say, okay, what is the intervention plan for my child? And I want to make sure that we have it in writing and that it is shared with every member of this team, and so that we are all on the same page. Let me see if I even have an example, because I've done this work for years. Let me see if I've got anything on this laptop. Yeah, so let me make sure this doesn't have any information on it that's particular to a child. So for example, right, like this was a child that I was working with where very severe, behavioral escalations. And so I spent time observing this young person in the different settings that he was in throughout the day. I said, these are what his behaviors look like as he gets more escalated. This is what the staff can do. This is what the staff can say in those moments. Here's what not to do because it only makes it worse. And let's get everybody on the same page. And so, I guess my short answer is, make a list in terms of what you feel is needed, and then go into that conversation saying, it's important to me that all of you are on the same page. And so I want to make sure that we have a clearly crafted intervention plan for my child, and that everybody on this team has an opportunity to both contribute to it and also have a final copy of it. And that includes knowing when we're going to be checking in and what we're going to be talking about when we check in. And I want to make sure that maybe it also includes something like a clear behavior script or escalation map, so everybody who works with my son knows what to do when he's behaviorally escalated and what not to do. And if you
Thank
want
you
to be
so much.
vulnerable enough, sure, you can even give them some feedback and say, talking about trauma and then leaving out a conversation about what has helped us get through those things is more hurtful than it is helpful. So if we're going to talk about the loss of his father at 4.5 years old, I also want to talk about what helped us to get through that, because that is the glue that holds us together today.
Thank you for that, Ricky. I see we have another hand raised, Castellina. Hoping I'm pronouncing that right. If not, let me know. Is that correct?
It's Castellina.
Castellina, how you doing? Thank you for being here tonight. What is your question for Ricky?
My question for Ricky is when you were talking about behavioral issues and how it is learned, how would you see that through a child who is autistic? Because I deal with that on a normal basis, and I don't see it the same way as it being something that they learn because of how their frustration gets to them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So with autism, with autism, obviously, or with any young person who's neurodivergent in those ways, you have underlying challenges that young person experiences with processing information, processing sensory input, regulating and identifying, being able to identify the emotions that other folks are having, being able to identify their own feelings, etc. So in that regard, you're right, behavior isn't learned in the same way that I was talking about the example of a young person growing up in a family where they're learning kind of dysfunctional behaviors and they're acting them out. In the child with autism, that child is behaving in ways that are helping them to cope with what's going on with their brain chemistry, etc. Now, having said that, though, when we look at ABA, applied behavioral analysis, which is one of the most effective ways to work with young people on the autism spectrum, and it's just one of several different modalities, but it's one that has a lot of research behind it. ABA and behavioral modification approaches, et cetera, are still based on an understanding that a young person does learn different skills to get those needs met. So in a way, they are still learning a behavioral language, but you're right that the challenges that we're seeing with a young person who's experienced autism is not the same as a young person who's experienced trauma and is reenacting the ways that they've seen families cope with different forms of addiction or dysfunction, et cetera. So absolutely it is different, and there is a similarity in terms of, for all of us as human beings, we do learn ways to get our needs met based on how other people respond to us, based on what works and what doesn't. And so when we look at approaches like ABA and other forms of therapies and behavior therapies for children on the autism spectrum, they are still very much teaching a behavioral language. This is a way to get that need met, or this is a way to appropriately ask for help, or to give or receive touch, or to help you calm down. And those issues around self-regulation and emotional regulation, I think, are especially critical when we think about young people on the autism spectrum. And we have programs in schools like zones of regulation, et cetera, that can help with that. So there are definitely differences. And thank you for highlighting that, because I should have clarified that in that conversation, I was not taking into account the impact of different disabilities or neurodivergence, but was instead specifically talking about it within the context of, I think, a trauma-informed approach, although there are similarities.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So I have a
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
So Ricky, so as you talked about some of the factors, external factors, you talk about ACEs in our last event. I was just wondering, like, has there ever been any research done for people who live in higher crime, higher poverty, areas where there's high food insecurities, but these the kids have loving homes, right? Is there a balancing effect of having say a loving mother, loving father, to the potential crisis that's outside or maybe even inside the home?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, their research on relationships as a protective factor focused on young people who grew up in communities with a lot of different forms of community trauma. Things like generational poverty, um, substance abuse issues like opiate addiction, crystal meth addiction, different types of substance abuse issues that have become kind of an epidemic in different communities. So they specifically focused their research on looking at children and young people growing up in communities that are impacted by a variety of different forms of community trauma. And that research showed that the presence of those protective relationships, those supportive relationships, were one of the most important contributing factors to having that toxic stress become tolerable enough for that young person to not just survive, but thrive. And so those relationships make a huge difference. Now, there's been some interesting studies that have shown that that can also include relationships with even teachers and mentors. So it doesn't just have to be someone in the home, even though obviously the home can be an incredible refuge and place of support to nurture the health and well-being and innate resilience of that young person. Even in war zones, et cetera. But we even have research of looking at some communities, I think it was in Minnesota or in Iowa, looking at communities with a lot of generational poverty, a lot of opiate addiction, and finding that high school students that had a teacher at school who they felt cared about them. In high school teachers get students for 50 minutes a day, were as much as 400% less likely to use opiates in those communities, just because they felt like there was an adult at school who would care enough about them to be worried and concerned. So relationships have an incredible impact on supporting the resilience of a young person. Now, having said that, do they protect them from everything? No, I wish that they could. I wish we could love the people in our lives enough to protect them from some of the things life throws our way, but they make a huge difference in helping people to weather those storms.
So, Ricky, first let me say that this is some of the most important information that I've seen. And I know that a lot of educators would really love to get their hands on a video like this and perhaps even invite you to speak. The question that I have is, what kinds of connections are you aware of where people are trying to connect the parents and the school? Because it sounds like a lot of the trauma and the behaviors that you're talking about begin like in the family and are sometimes acted out in the family and in the school. Is there anything you can share about strategies to bring the two together?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of different approaches, some more successful than others. So Sound Discipline, which is the organization that I mentioned that's based out of Seattle, has partnered with some different schools and school districts. In fact, some of the schools are actually in Rainier Beach. There might be two schools in Kent. There's a couple schools in Everett. a couple schools in Bellevue. They work with, they're local. And they have done evenings for parents and caregivers to come to the school. They focus on a lot of the topics that I've just spoken about. So they do a lot of good work, but they are just a nonprofit organization. So I think, I don't know that they're nonprofit, but they're basically, they're an organization. They don't get to run the show, so to speak. So they get invited in, and if schools and school districts have the space, the funding, and prioritize it, they do some really good work with parents and caregivers and bringing them into the school to have some of these conversations that are very similar to a lot of the research that I've spoken about in the approach. I really like their work. I'm a big fan of them, and I'm their executive, their founder, who's I think now stepped down, Dr. Jody McVitie. She's phenomenal. So I like their work, and they do some work with parents and schools in the Seattle area. Then there are, I have also examples of schools and districts that I've worked with, where I've done evenings for parents and caregivers, et cetera. And then also, and have even done them virtually, because not everybody can physically come to a school to have a conversation around this work.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes there's longer term work. I mean, I remember, my co-author Victoria has been working in education for decades. And I remember, this was a while ago now, but she, for a period of time, ran kind of different restorative circles and sessions for parents and caregivers in Everett. Specifically, I believe she was looking at parents and caregivers of Black students and looking at how to heal some of the harm that has been done. Because sometimes, one of the things we have to realize is that a lot of times parents and caregivers, they didn't have positive experiences in school.
Right,
So the trust isn't there. And
right.
and so Victoria did a lot of work to try to build that relationship. She was working as a consultant. She wasn't even an employee of the district, but she did a lot of work as a Black woman and as a Black mother and as a Black educator to then think about, how do I bridge these communities between these educators and these parents and families, and how do I help their voices to be heard? Because a lot of us are carrying some pretty intense wounds, could even be types of trauma, from our education experiences. And so that shows
Yeah.
up. In fact, there was research by the Pew Center that found that, no, it was by, I can't remember who conducted this study. I think it was Panorama, actually. They surveyed, about 10 or 20,000 parents, caregivers, et cetera, across the US. 1 out of 5, 20%, 1 out of 5 said that one of the reasons that they don't engage with their child's school is because of fear that if they were to say something negative, the school would retaliate against their child. Now, behavior is a form of communication, right? So if a parent is not engaging with a school, that's a form of communication. You get what I'm saying? Like when we really
Yep.
start to view behavior as a form of communication, it applies to everybody, in the sense that if a child is having a meltdown, or if an adult is refusing to engage, or an adult behaves a certain way, we can still pause and say, what is that human being communicating to me through their behavior? And that can apply across, even when we look at things like disability, neurodivergence, age, et cetera. What is that human being communicating to me through their behavior? And so that, we can look at the behavior of parents and educators and think about what's being communicated here. Perhaps it's a lack of trust, a lack of a sense of safety. So Victoria did work for doing, listening sessions to hear what those concerns were, and helping parents and to start to feel heard by the district. So lots of different, examples.
Okay, thank you.
So I can ask another question unless anyone else has one. So Ricky, so we talked about, in areas of high trauma or high community trauma. What about the other side? Like, we're seeing a lot of the school shootings, the school violence. This is coming from, these are coming from neighborhoods where kids aren't facing as much of the obvious community type trauma. Do you have any insights on what's going on in those situations?
Well, one of the first things to acknowledge, and this was something that I talked about on Saturday, and we didn't get to do a deep dive into adverse childhood experiences and trauma in tonight's session. We just briefly glossed over it. But I talked about this on Saturday, and I'm happy to revisit it, which is that we know that trauma is prevalent across race, socioeconomic status, geographic regions, so rural, urban, suburban communities. So what that means is that we have studies that show that even children growing up in middle class, suburban, or even wealthy families and communities are just as likely to experience physical, emotional, sexual abuse at home, domestic violence at home, someone in the home suffering from a mental illness or a substance abuse issue, etc. So a lot of those household forms of trauma are just as prevalent in middle class, wealthy families. We have a lot of stereotypes, I think, in our head where we think, oh, it must be folks in this particular group or this demographic that experience more trauma at home. That's not true. So trauma is now, having said that, the way that trauma is responded to, the access that people have to care, that can be heavily impacted by things like poverty, racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, ableism, anti-immigrant discrimination, etc. So trauma is prevalent across humanity. The way that trauma is responded to, in other words, whether or not a child receives care or punishment. And I think one of the things that, this is something that I think is kind of interesting, Aubrey, is that when we think about this and we think about the stereotypes and assumptions people can have, Dr. Moore has signed off here, otherwise he might appreciate this. I've actually had wealthy independent schools, that serve very wealthy children and families say to me, Ricky, when you talk to our staff, could you really not talk as much about trauma and just talk more about anxiety and depression, because our kids don't really experience those types of trauma. And it's not true. It's a stereotype to think that a wealthy or affluent or middle class family, that nobody in that family is going to struggle with something like alcoholism, or there might not be sexual abuse, etc. That's all based on stereotypes. So one of the things that I then get curious about is, are those the students, the ones who go on to do the school shootings or things like that, are those students who slip through the cracks because of a lot of assumptions people have about what trauma looks like or doesn't look like, that might be informed by biases? So you see that white suburban middle class boy who's quiet, keeps to himself, and you don't think anything of it. Instead, you're focusing on someone else as the problem, so to speak, or the one who needs support, but you don't realize every young person in a school building needs to be known by name and by need and be connected to at least one adult in the building, including that white middle class boy who keeps to himself, who could be internalizing a lot of rage, depression, bullying, abuse, and one day is going to take it out on all of us. And I used to work in alternative settings where I've had to actually go through that and be in lockdown because of attempts being made on people's lives. So it is a particular experience when the chicken comes home to roost, so to speak, and you have to look back at, where were we not paying attention because we were either so busy or we had an assumption about what trauma looks like. I feel like there was someone else who had their, okay, I might have missed it. I thought there was a hand that had gotten raised.
That was me.
Oh, great. Okay.
No, I was just going to reiterate on when you were talking about parents feeling like if they were to speak to an educator or to the school board about the complications within their home, that they would look like they would be retaliated at or retaliated towards. And I've been fighting for my kids and the things that they've gone through for over 20 years, because my daughter was diabetic. I had to fight the school board to keep nurses in there full time versus just once or twice out of the week, due to the fact, in order for me as a single mom being able to be there for my child, I could not carry a job and take out from school because she needs an insulin injection. Yep. It took me 4 years for that to happen, but I got it to happen. And it does take a voice to do so. And at the same time, those that want to but feel that pressure because they've either seen it or they've had people already, they've already labeled them as a certain type of person. So they start taking fear and belief in that. So it makes it harder for them to stand up for that. You know, I'm doing it again for my son, like I talked to you earlier about autism.
Yep.
And it took me 4 years for him to get accepted in the program. You know, I fought since he was in preschool. And now he has been accepted. He starts this January. It gets exhausting.
Yes.
You know, it is very hard.
Yep.
And yes, there have been times where I did see that I was labeled a certain way due to the way my child acts. His reaction at school is not the same reaction at home. But at the same time, I had to constantly reiterate to them that it's a fear factor for him. It's a change. Transition is one of the hardest things
Yes.
for a child with that type of behavior.
Yep.
And it took two of his educators from kindergarten to help me and back me, and then have the Autistic Center at Seattle Children's back me, and then his, you know, neurologist back me, and now his doctors back me. It took a lot for them to see that autism spectrum, or autism in a whole, is not just, you know, a thing. It is reality, and their reality is not like ours.
Yes.
You know.
Yep.
But it is hard for a lot of families to do what I've done, because they do see that one time of being labeled by someone or being seen a certain way, and it will put that fear into them. So those barriers do exist.
Yes.
You know, but yeah, I just wanted to talk on that.
Thank you. Thank you. And to what, you know, and it begs that access to care, barriers to access to care, how much work and struggle you had to go through as a parent in order to get the level of care that your child deserves. And all of those hoops and all of those things you had to jump through, and how much of that is also connected to systemic and structural inequities within public education, where all of those barriers get put in place because we don't have a BCBA. For folks who don't know what that is, that's someone who would be specializing and being able to support children on the autism spectrum, et cetera. You have all these barriers to care that show up. So then the parent has to become the crusader, the warrior for their child, which puts the parent in a situation where how can you build allies and feel supported and feel safe and feel connected and feel heard if you have to constantly show up to fight for your kid? And you know, a lot of my work is focused on the educators, because if an educator can view behavior as a form of communication, then they can look at a child on the autism spectrum who's having a meltdown because of a transition or a change and go, let me not punish this child, and ask myself, what is this child's behavior communicating right now? Because if transitions make this child feel dysregulated and unsafe, then I need to provide support rather than problematize, pathologize, or refuse support and put up another barrier for that parent to have to fight through. So thank you for your advocacy for your child. But yes, to everything you said about the way that retaliation, that negativity, those barriers can absolutely show up and disproportionately do so.
So Ricky, what kinds of advice or strategies are given for teachers these days, you know, when a child acts out and maybe throws chairs around the room, you know, starts pushing other kids, and you know, becoming, you know, physically, you know, acting out. I've heard in some instances they just clear the room until the child settles down, you know, or expends all of that energy. And so I'm curious to know, you know, are there other solutions to that kind of behavior, that kind of communications?
Yes. The best solution, if you will, is to be, as a school, as proactive as possible, rather than just being reactive.
Yeah,
And
preventive, yes.
yeah, and so the work that I do, you know, and this is, I mean, we have, you know, 90 minutes this evening. So the work I do with schools is to really look at how do we help educators to understand strategies to help students to regulate, to be able to communicate in and build trusting relationships, to be able to problem solve, to engage in conflict resolution through restorative practices and approaches. So, you know, we look at different classroom-based strategies. We also look at how do you plan for the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of your students. So if you have a young person who struggles with transitions during the school day, or you have a young person who has a very hard time accepting no as an answer, or you have a young person who sometimes shows up at school and they haven't slept, they haven't eaten, they're exhausted, they've experienced significant neglect, and they might show up in your classroom and tear your room apart. How do you start to plan for those needs and anticipate them? So maybe you check in with that child at the start of the day. Maybe that child has a check-in, check-out mentor. Maybe for severe situations, you map the escalation cycle and you get everybody on the same page so you know what to do when and what not to do, so you can prevent as many of those room clearing situations from happening as possible. So my focus is on as much as prevention, and then we look at response and having a response that is consistent. And what I'm about to share with folks actually applies to across the board, not just the child who throws their desk across the classroom, but can also apply to the child who's having a tantrum or a meltdown. Anytime that there is a conflict, in fact, this could even apply to your marriage, folks who are listening. Anytime that there is a conflict or a significant behavioral escalation, neurologically, we have to regulate, relate, and then reason. So that child needs to, if they're upset, if they're frustrated, and this is true for adults too, we're going to be more effective at resolving a conflict if we calm down, find our calm, get some sense of peace, some sense of solid footing. So we help that child to regulate, walk with me, talk with me, take some deep breaths. You need to listen to some music for a few minutes and calm down, fine, whatever that might be, regulate. Then we relate, we listen to the other person. And this is hard, especially especially if it's your own child or your partner or someone who's close to you. This is where things get really difficult, is we have to listen to their side of the story, how they perceive things. And sometimes young people are nonverbal, so sometimes we actually have to learn what their behavior lets us know about how they're feeling and how they see things. But letting a young person tell you, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is why I'm upset. And we don't interrogate, we don't say you're wrong, we don't say you made that up, you're lying to me. We just listen. And that helps to calm the limbic system of the brain. So when we regulate, we calm the brainstem region. We relate, we calm the limbic system. Now we can engage that prefrontal cortex. Now we can reason and say, okay, let's try to solve this problem. Or we say, okay, what can we do to fix this? Or it's time to talk about the consequences based on what just happened. But we do that after we regulate, we relate, and then we reason. So when we're responding to those significant behavioral challenges, we have to help that student to regulate, we then have to listen to them, and then we have to problem solve and figure out what the consequences are or what we do to prevent this from happening again in the future. So a lot of my work is preventative strategies, how we plan for the behavioral needs of students, and then when we look at response, how are we consistent in having teams and teamwork to be able to respond to those crises. And I have a lot of empathy for educators. I want to be very clear here, because I know that we talked about retaliation and difficulties and barriers to care, and I highlighted some of the negative aspects of the system of education. I have a lot of empathy for the human beings, the educators themselves, that have to work within those broken systems. Because a lot of times you have educators having to defend a system that they know is under-resourced. They know potentially has the potential to cause harm. The reason they know it, because they feel it in their bodies with the stress, the overwhelm, the putting out fires all day long, the thanklessness of the job as an educator. So their fatigue, their exhaustion, their burnout as a result of working within a system that is built to burn people out. That's why professional burnout for educators is not a personal failure. It's a systemic one. So I have a lot of empathy for the educators that sit there and have to work within burnout systems and work within schools where, I mean, one school I worked with, they had 25 removals a day from students from classrooms when I started working with them because of severe behavioral issues. Within 3 months, we brought that down to 0 to 4. And we turned that school around by getting people on the same page, by identifying our preventative strategies, and getting a team together to respond to those moments of crisis. But I had a lot of empathy for those folks because they did not have the funding or the staffing or the resources that they truly deserved and needed to adequately serve those children. They were doing the best they could within a broken system. So we did the best we could to build effective systems and teams and teamwork to address those challenges. So I just want to be balanced because I noticed that I was focusing on some of the more negative realities of the education system. And I'm quite familiar with them, having worked in them, but I want to also highlight the heart and the hard work that goes into shifting and transforming them.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left. Does anyone have any closing questions for Ricky before we start to close out the evening?
There was a question in the chat about where to learn about strategy, some of the things I talked about, some of the things. So one piece is, like I mentioned, sound discipline, great resources, et cetera. The work I do, I don't plug the book, right? But like, if you want to read about the actual work I do in schools, the workbook Victoria, Amber, and I wrote highlights, we have schools that have used this. We had one in Seattle, actually, that had 50% of their staff leave because they said behavior was out of control. And they used this workbook and have completely turned the school around. In fact, last we talked to them, they only had 9 students receiving tier 3 behavioral supports out of 500. And that was in a school where 50% of the staff had quit because they said behavior was out of control. And I didn't even work with them I did one session with them as a coach. They did most of that work using the Building Resilience book as a workbook for their school.
Building resilience?
Yeah, I don't advertise as much as I should. Dr. Moore should actually help me with this because he knows how to hashtag everything and turn it into an advertisement, and I don't. But I'm holding it up in the screen, and maybe we can send it along in the follow-ups. But all of the work that I do with schools, and this is a book geared towards educators, comes from this, and that is the 99% of the work I do is within school systems, and then sometimes with community organizations, nonprofits, folks like CNC, et cetera.
Is the book online? Is it digital yet?
Actually, there's through the publisher, you can get an ebook version, and I think you can get an ebook version on Amazon as well. It's available on Amazon and everywhere books are sold, you can order it. Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, Melvin, I'm going to be begging Ricky for the presentation so that we can post it on the website, and I'll also post the name of the book as well.
Great.
Thank you.
So that we can make sure that everyone knows that, because there was that question in there. Any other?
Right. And did you have a question or? Seemed like he was on you off.
Who was that, Barb? Okay. So while we sort that out, if anyone, so I also posted a link to a survey in the chat window for tonight's event. If you could please do that. If you'd like more information, which will also include a link to the page where we will be storing Ricky's awesome presentation, please put your email in that link. We don't spam anybody or anything, so please put your email. And also next week, this exact same time, well, 6:30 to 8, we'll be hosting a meditation event. We'll have a guided meditation that'll be hosted by the founder of the Alabama Meditation Center, which is in Mobile, Alabama. So she'll be walking us through and teaching us about meditation, how meditation can be used for stress reduction, and actually walking us through a guided meditation. If you've never done it, it's incredible. It's really cool. So please make sure to sign up.
And that's a perfect follow-up to today's conversation about self-regulation. So it's a perfect opportunity to put what we talked about tonight into practice, because mindfulness, movement, making things manageable, that meditation piece is so helpful. for supporting self-regulation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if there's no closing, or Ricky, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make besides that? That was
I
fantastic.
just want to, you know, what lifts my spirits is when people show up in these conversations. And so I just want to thank everyone for this opportunity to learn from and with you all, and thank everyone who joined tonight, and folks who also joined for the multiple sessions. So I just want to honor your work and your commitment, because it's hard to find this time in our schedules. So be well, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you, Ricky. And thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Ricky.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So we'll close out now. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Phillips. Thank you, Aubrey. Mr. Tate, I think, signed off already, but thank you all so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Always
Thank
great to see you.
Good to see you. Take care.
See
And
you.
if you try any recipes from that vegan cookbook I recommended, let me know.
I know, I got it, Brian Terry. I
Yep.
didn't get the book yet, but I'm getting it from the library just in case
Okay.
this stuff. Vegan.
There's a tempeh and grits recipe in that book. It takes forever to make, but I mean, because grits take a long time anyway. Like if you're really going to make them from scratch, grits can take a long time, period. But that recipe is phenomenal. So I highly recommend it anyhow. All right. Take good care.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
See you soon.